Thanks very much for turning up to my talk today, which is how chemophobia, appeal to nature, and Paleo Puritanism can scupper our keto success. What has this got to do with keto? This is Ketofest. It's not PlatoFest. And I'm going to be talking about things that are slightly different to some of the other things that have been talked about today. Most of what people have been talking about today is the endocrine system, by and large. And it's an internal communication between disparate components of our body and ways of affecting those different parts of our body. And when it goes wrong, of course, we suffer, and we often don't know why, because we don't know how that communication is working until we become an endocrinologist. Keto helps us to get that communication working properly very often, and that's part of keto's major effect. It's getting the endocrine system's messages to work properly, and that different parts of the body get the message, whether it's leptin or insulin or anything else. There's another system, and that's called the language system. You might have heard of it. We tend to use it. It's the endocrine system of the body politic, shall we say. And when it goes wrong, we suffer, and often we don't know why as well. And I hope that philosophy and linguistics can help to get that communication working properly and to make us understand why certain weird communicative problems might be happening, why the messages that have been getting out about conventional nutrition seem so counter to the facts that to us seem so obvious. An important part of language, I need to start with my assumptions. My assumptions are that evolutionary biology does provide useful data on a healthful diet, because I will be talking about things that I think are fairy tales within this talk. So I want to make sure that I am not dissing the whole field. As an example, chronic insulinemia is not usually compatible with healthful longevity, and the general prescriptions of paleo are thus helpful when they tally with keto. But longevity specifically requires hacks, and anybody who's heard Dr. Rosedale talk knows what I mean. So what are some of the things that go wrong with the communicative system? Well, one of them is the seductive enthymeme, and enthymeme can mean a number of things, but what I'm talking about today is something that sophists and people who want to pull the wool over your eyes have used since Greek times, frankly. And it's an argument where a major premise is quietly removed or ignored. It's very popular with sophists, rhetoricians, and politicians, and so on. An example of that is, where there's smoke, there's fire. Initially, that sounds very common sense, but of course, you're missing the premise that all smoke is created by fire. Therefore, if you see smoke, there must have been fire. We all know that's not true. We can think of plenty of situations where we've noticed there's smoke without fire. So what seems like very common sense, the moment you actually state the argument properly, falls apart. But of course, it beguiles us with the seductive way that it just pours out. Another enthymeme is just eat real food, and I'm not a fan of that phrase, as you'll see soon. So let's problematize, for example, paleo. I talked on the podcast about problematization, and that's where you take something, and it's part of critical theory, where you take an idea that seems very stable and simple and atomic, and you purposefully pull it apart, see that when you put it back together again, you get the same thing, basically. So you try to turn what is a solution back into a problem. And there's a problem with paleo very often in its common discussion. This was from a vegetarian's page about what is paleo and why is it dangerous. And it also goes into why keto is even more dangerous. But of course, paleo has a very useful set of images associated with it. The troglodyte with his club. It's old-fashioned, it's barbaric, and you need to avoid it. So we can make fun of all the vegans who talk about paleo in that sense. But it's not just the vegans. This was from a paleo website, Paleo Living, and notice what's in the heart. That's paleo. For me, I think something's missing there, but there's a reason why there's something missing there. That apparently is the paleo food pyramid. Notice it's full of lean meats and fish. Lean, very lean, because if you want to be lean, you need to eat lean, and if you want to be fat, you need to eat fat. And that's still on Lauren Cordain's page today. It says that you need to eat lean meats and fish. Something's missing. Who knows who this guy is? Dr. Asim Malhotra, he's a British cardiologist. He's doing brilliant work. In his published papers, he's talking about how the lipid hypothesis is complete rubbish. But when he's brought out in public to put a happy face on the hypothesis, this is what he has to do. He has to spend his whole life pouring olive oil on leaves, because that is what his message has to be. And you think, well, why. And it's to do with a kind of Puritanism which is out there, or more accurately, asceticism. And this is something that's in almost every religion and philosophy. Asceticism kind of denies worldly pleasure or sees hedonism as a spiritual or moral threat, and we all have experienced this sort of moralism. And this seeps into paleo and even sometimes into keto, where people go overboard about trying to punish other people for daring to have their keto treats. You shouldn't experience the flavor of sweet anymore, or karma, or whatever else you want to think will come and get you. Where does all this asceticism come from? Nietzsche talks about it in some interesting ways, the philosopher Nietzsche. On the genealogy of morality, in one of his essays, said, what do ascetic ideals mean? And he says, ascetics, they stay away from everything which creates an emotional effect, which makes blood, no salt in the diet, he mentions, the hygiene of the fakir. And he continues to ask why that might be the case. And he says, it's the attempt to attain for human beings something approaching what winter hibernation is for some kind of animals, the minimum consumption and processing of material stuff which can still sustain life, but which does not actually enter consciousness. And he says, ironically, for this purpose, an astonishing amount of human energy has been expended. And that's a really interesting idea, because if you think about it, the notion of trying to limit your experiences of the highs and lows is almost like a kind of self-medication against bipolar or against depression. If we can just limit all the inputs, we hope that all the processing and the outputs will be limited as well. And this is something that a lot of philosophies have seen. Let's go back even further. There is some more perhaps cynical reasons why people have been urged to be ascetic, to not enjoy the meats of their life, for example. And there were the sumptuary laws in the late Middle Ages. And these were instituted as a way for the nobility to cap the conspicuous consumption of the bourgeoisie. So they say, don't eat meat, don't wear good clothes. Really, because of course the nobility wanted to reserve all of those for themselves, but they would say it's somehow bad for your soul, it's morally suspect, and it will reflect badly on you in some way in either this life or the next. And you can see that Montaigne wrote about it, and he said, the princes shall eat turbot, shall wear velvet and gold lace, and interdict these things to the people. What is more, to bring him into greater esteem and set everyone more agog to eat and wear them. So, of course, there is then the counter side to asceticism, that the forbidden fruits or the forbidden meats become even more attractive. But let's go back even further than that. And let's go back to kind of the beginning of Western civilization. Now, I'm going to talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition, but it's actually probably closer to Christian than Judeo, because in Judaism there's a complex relationship with meat eating. There's both celebration and revulsion. There's celebration in that if you have to eat meat in festivals, it's actually considered a good deed, but you can't eat any of the blood. So there's a complicated relationship here. So I'm probably talking more about early Christianity and how that tallied with the Gnostics and so on. But both sides kind of agreed that the Garden of Eden was pretty much a vegan paradise. And if you look at Genesis, it said, God said, behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed as food and every green herb for meat. So that's your meat. Thou shalt eat the herb of the field. And that was generally what people were considered, well, the two people were considered to have eaten at the time. And it's very interesting that this is an excerpt from Hieronymus Bosch. And you can see that fruit was an ambiguous symbol, because on the one hand, it was part of the innocence of the Garden of Eden, but one in particular, as you well know, was not at all. So there's a kind of really ambiguous relationship that we've had with fruit throughout our ages. Sometimes it's seen as decadent and problematic, and at other times it's seen as innocent and wonderful. So this is probably what dietitians do to fruit, I think. It's an accurate illustration. And so where do all these problematic ideas come from? Well, if we look at the word carnivore, carnality, it literally means of the flesh. See also carnivore and some folk etymologies of carnival. It's very easy when you're talking about one sort of flesh to begin talking about other sorts of flesh. And this is made explicit. Again, this is from Galatians. The acts of the flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity, and then drunkenness, orgies, and the like. And then it goes on, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is a very obvious contrast, and this is not the only one that you'll find both in the Bible and in the texts that surround it. And this comes down to what I talked about earlier, which is Gnosticism. And Gnosticism was the shunning. It's very early. It preceded Christianity, but it was very much tied into early Christianity, where it was believed that the world that we see, the dirty, entropic material world, was the product of some devilish intelligence, and it was pulling the wool over our eyes against the more perfect world which was being hidden from us. And there's a real fear of meaty mortality. In a sense, it's a spiritual fleeing from the second law of thermodynamics. And the Gnostic ideas, I think, are so prevalent still. You can go even back further to Plato's ideas of the ideal realm of forms, and all we see are these dirty shadows in a cave. The notion that the fleshly is somehow the corrupt and the imperfect. So when you see the fear of red meat, the shunning of the material world, the shunning of the carnal, carnophobia preceded Ansel Keys by millennia, and it's why even today paleo can't feel completely at ease with red meat and animal fat, except in fish. Notice that's something that's also shared. I believe many Catholic people consider that fish is an honorary vegetable, which is why you can have it on Friday and at Lent. So it's something that the paleo people share, and that's why if you've looked at any prescription of LCHF or paleo on the front cover of a magazine or a book, it'll always be a little sliver of salmon with the broccoli, because that's allowed. Now, if it's bad for men to enjoy the flesh, it's even more sinful for women to enjoy the flesh. And this is part of that funny meme, which was women alone enjoying salad. Somebody noticed that all the stock art libraries had dozens and dozens and dozens of pictures of women doing this. And somebody even made a painting of it. And I think that's a very good painting, and it kind of shows the real desperation that's going on there. Because she clearly doesn't just want salad, but society has told her that salad is the ladylike thing to have. And this can be humorous in one sense, but it's actually tragic. Women tend to have insufficient protein levels, they have low iron levels, they're borderline anemic very often, and yet they are told to eat leaves with the occasional drizzle of olive oil on it. And this is a tragic problem. And then when you look at things like osteoporosis later in life, which is related to getting insufficient good protein, it's criminal that we allow this old meme to continue. But I've seen it myself. I went to a steakhouse in London a few months ago. I ordered the fattiest ribeye that was available. And this is literally what happened. The waiter said, "And madam, you will maybe have the fillet steak?" And she said, "No, I'll have the brisket." She says, "Madam, that's a bit fatty." So it's clear that these ideas are very deeply situated in people, and I've spoken to my wife and to other women, and they say constantly there's this, if they order a big steak, it's considered a little bit odd. So I thought I'm happy to see that there are counter memes being developed at the moment, and I encourage their spread. Let's take a diversion to Dr. Kellogg, because he's my favorite madman to talk about, and I talked about him on the podcast. He did get some things right before we diss him completely, and this is, something he wrote, and he was correct. However, he believed there's a far bigger poison than tobacco, and he believed that the biggest poison was masturbation. He believed that this would cause every illness that you hear of. Every modern disease of civilization was caused by masturbation. Men and women would get different sorts of diseases. Women, their reproductive organs would drop out of them. It was actually astonishing when you read the rubbish that he was talking about. He was really obsessed with preventing it, because again, it's a sin of the flesh, and we can then go back to some of the things we were talking about before. And he believed that masturbation was intently associated with meat eating. And this is explicit in his writings. It's carnality and carnivory intertwined. It happens again and again and again. It is no coincidence. And he had a number of ways of dealing with masturbation. This was from a museum of his sanitarium. This is for gentlemen, so that at night they wouldn't allow their nightly pleasures they would allow them to disturb them in horrific ways. Women had things that I wouldn't even put up here. But also this is another way of dealing with masturbation. Cornflakes. And I know it's ridiculous. But this is explicit. Your bowl of cornflakes was invented to stop you from jerking off. And so when you see somebody who is sitting there enjoying their bowlful with their skimmed milk, because it mustn't be too pleasurable, then you need to remember that next time. And so he invented that out of this weird concoction came a new notion of breakfast. And of course, it shouldn't have caught on, but his wilier brother then quietly added some molasses to the cornflakes, because of course they tasted terrible. And then, so suddenly we had, and his wilier brother was also commercially clever, in that he realized that to take a commodity product that you can now transport all over the country via train, that costs you almost nothing, put it in a box and you can charge 2 or 3 orders of magnitude more for it, and you can convince people it's good for them with a capital G and a halo over the top of it, then you're in good business. And we can see this happen again and again and again. It is so striking how the ideas of religious purity are again and again foisted upon eating oats and grains. And all over the world, brands use this, and it's certainly not a coincidence. Notice that that nice gentleman will not only save your soul, but he'll save your heart, because it helps remove cholesterol. It removes the sin of all sorts from your heart. So there are really beguiling enthymemes and fallacies, and we'll quickly discuss some of them. There's the appeal to nature. It's not the naturalistic fallacy, which some people call it. That's a slightly different one, which we won't go into. But it's basically saying any X which is natural is good. X is natural, thus X is good. And even though when it's rendered like that, we can see that that's nonsensical, the best of us still get trapped by this fallacy. There are 2 ways that it's wrong. There's the kind of shallow way that it's wrong, in that anthrax is natural and deadly nightshade is natural. But there's another more profound way that it's wrong, in that I'd like anybody to tell me what isn't of nature. Because if you want to claim that you are supernatural, that a nuclear weapon is supernatural, then you need to provide evidence for that claim. For me, that still fits in with natural explanations of the world. So when we talk about a natural, we've got to realize that it's wrong in every sense of the term, in that it's both a category error, and also we can think of plenty of natural things that are profoundly disturbing. And this, on the left-hand side, is a very famous hymn that is almost a parody of a hymn that is sung in Anglican churches. And on the right is the Monty Python corollary to that hymn. So all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. But of course, Monty Python said, all things sick and horrible, all evil, great and small, all things foul and dangerous, the Lord God made them all, which of course he did, if you want to believe that. So we have to assume that if nature is the totality of everything, then we can't use nature as an argument for what is good to eat. Now, we can say that our bodies evolved to eat certain things, and therefore we are more habituated to eat them, and therefore we know what the results of eating them would be, and therefore this novel molecule that we have not ingested before requires testing or requires certain caution. But that's very different from assuming it will be bad. Then I've just squashed 2 fallacies into one. There's the no true Scotsman fallacy, and there's the begging the question fallacy. And I've just called it the begging the true Scotsman. Because the no true Scotsman fallacy is you define something, and then somebody else gives you a counterexample and say, oh yeah, but that's not real X, that's not real food. Or that's not real meat, that's processed meat, or that's not real this. So you're constantly excluding stuff from your category. And of course, begging the question is something that we always do, where we say, obviously fruit and veg are important for a healthy diet. After all, a healthy eating plan always includes fruit and vegetables. That was a quote. And that, I think, is a very clear and obvious state about begging the question. And then this is no true Scotsman. All processing is bad. What about cooking, fermenting? Well, those aren't true processes. And then, of course, there's the other enthymeme. There's natural. Those dates are natural. And yet, that citric acid is artificial because it was created in a lab. Yet the citric acid is molecularly identical to the citric acid that you'd extract from the lemon. So if you have a problem with eating that citric acid, you have something called the genetic fallacy, and you assume that its origin story somehow imbues in it something dangerous. Whereas the very natural date that we had over there is processed, of course, and also it gives you a ton of fructose and glucose, and if you tested it on your glucometer, you wouldn't be very happy. Then there's raw. Try eating those raw. And all those horrible foods are processed. The olives, the charcuterie, the cheese, even the nuts, they're all processed. Which would you prefer to eat? Which is better? Which would you consider a part of the keto diet? And yet I bet many people say, oh, yeah, well, raw is good and processed is bad. But you've got to be more perspicacious when you're using these terms. Otherwise, it becomes like a nursery rhyme. Of course, we're used to using good and bad. These Manichaean ways of describing the world are very problematic, and I don't even need to tell you why. You just need to look at that picture. Then there's organic. Did you know that insecticide is organic? It's full of heavy metals and all sorts of things, but because arbitrarily it's been considered compatible with organic farming, it's now organic. And then there's jerf. Just eat real food. I think we can probably agree, okay, that the egg and the steak tartare and even maybe the capers for some of us is real food. But then a vegan will say that's real food. How dare you tell me that that's not real food? In what sense isn't it real food? You've just shown me various processed things like the charcuterie board you'd be happy to say is real food. Why is my block of tofu not real food? And we then would have to say, well, we've just decided it's not real. That's the no true Scotsman fallacy again. We're not getting anywhere. Instead of throwing these strange labels at us, let us discuss about the hormonal disruptors inside the tofu. Let us talk about the big problems of soy production on the environment. Then we're talking about facts that can be validated. If you go, jerf, 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 you're acting like a child calling somebody else names or being part of a gang. Then, of course, there's the notion of the med diet, which is one of those really wonderful terms that can be used to mean anything you want it to be. We've heard doctors talk about the med diet, and that's kind of what they mean. There's some beans, a few grains, lots of fruit and vegetables, and probably a statin on the side there, which everybody in the Mediterranean takes with their sangria. But actually, that's also the med diet. Anybody who's been to the Med kind of knows that, but they don't talk about that when they talk about the med diet, do they? That is also the med diet. Anybody who's been to the Mediterranean knows that that is a profound constituent of the med diet. Have you ever read one of those glossy magazine descriptions of the med diet that's got a picture of that in there? No, because of course we're back to the horrific reminders of carnality, and we prefer to think of a few lovely tomatoes and beans and whatever. So you can see there's bountiful reasons why we like to package up our memes and keep them very sanitized. There are more problems. Being swept up in the data dance, as I call it, and this one really annoys me, and you sometimes, I dare say, hear it on certain podcasts. Not Richard and Carl's, fortunately, but there have been some others that are slightly less rigorous. And they will spend maybe 10 minutes discussing all the ways a particular study is wrong. It's crappy epidemiology. They've got all these confounders they're using, food questionnaires, the people are completely biased and they've got a list of honoraria as long as your arm, and they misrelate that data and they're playing games with that cohort and this cohort, and their conclusion bears no relationship to the significance, and then they spend 10 minutes talking about it and they say, but actually, maybe this is why processed meat is bad. Say, well, hold on, you can't use the study you've spent 10 minutes dissing as a kind of weird buttress of something that you're prepared to give concessions on. If it's bad science, throw it away and don't give it any concessions. And then if you want to discuss that processed meat is bad, bring some proper evidence to the table or be quiet about it. You can't nevertheless use it to support your pet biases or allow yourself to seem nuanced. And this is the one that I use. This study showing red meat gives you cancer is utterly confounded, uses food frequency questionnaires and so on, useless. But we'll agree that processed meat is bad. Not from that study, you won't. And another big problem is where there's a kind of reversion to the mean. We want to all just get along, which is a noble sentiment. We say, actually, you know what? We've got so much in common with the vegans and with this and with this, that, and that and the other. And to an extent, it's true. But then sometimes we make the mistake of not standing our ground and overstating that truth and then distorting the evidence that we know exists. I think you can be polite and you can look for commonalities, but too often, and I've seen this happen, people then use that to fudge the reality of the situation. If you believe something passionately and you've got the data and the evidence to back it up, don't ignore those facts just for very simple accommodationism. Another big problem is chemophobia. I had a discussion with a dietitian on Twitter once, and she was telling everybody that when you eat food, you should try your best to avoid chemicals. And I asked her if she could give me an example of a food that didn't have any chemicals. And And it was a gift because fortunately you say, well, fruit, for example. And of course, I'm sure you've seen this wonderful picture of if you had to label a banana, this would be its ingredient list, which of course is very frightening. And I'll give you a prime example of chemophobia that even affects some people in our community in the forums even. So we've got some asparagus there. And then we've got watercress equals aspartame, because aspartame is made up of 2 of the amino acids in both of those stuck together. That's it. There's no magic. There's no little demon behind one of the carbon atoms going out and boo. So if you believe that aspartame is very dangerous, you need to tell me why when it splits into those 2 amino acids that are in both of those, and one of those, unless you've got a phenylalanine problem, in which case you can't eat a lot of those anyway, then it behooves you to tell me where the magic comes in. Now, some people say, well, a very small amount of it can decompose into a little bit of methanol. Yes, when you say a little bit of methanol, you're talking about, is it 1 or 2 orders of magnitude less than you get from eating a small apple? So you've got to be very careful when you're talking about these things. Some chemicals can seem very scary. For example, the polyols, that's erythritol, one of my favorites. And people then will assume, okay, well, because we have problems with maltitol, which we do, and sorbitol, which we do, therefore erythritol, which is also a polyol, probably acts just like that, and it's going to give us bad stomach problems and turn into sugar anyway. No, it doesn't, because it's a different chemical that reacts very differently. You need to look at the data and don't just assume these weird category errors. Here's a chemical that's very often demonized. Beta-hydroxybutyrate. You've got to remember, all of Ketofest is a paean to 3 chemicals, basically. So we say, don't eat chemicals. No, we're here to celebrate 3 chemicals. There is a way to avoid chemicals. There is a way to avoid chemicals if you absolutely must. And that's homeopathy, which guarantees that there will be no chemicals inside the solution at all. So if you need to, you can do that. There are more problems. If we go off into the deep end, some of us, we like to have a kind of a big tent. And there are EMF paranoia, there's hardcore anti-vax, GMO issues, and friends. And many of these should be expressed. There is a rational concern that can be had, but it's often uselessly misfocused. So there'll be a general kind of scare talk about all of these things without precision and without using proper data, and then we all get written off as cranks. Oh, there's people who are saying that you should do keto. They also say you should wear your tinfoil hat and GMOs are all evil, and if you vaccinate yourself against polio, you'll explode. And then you get written off, and then the person who needs help with diabetes isn't. And this is not hyperbole. I've seen it happen. The whole community gets written off as cranks when you allow fellow travelers to bring in too many side issues without good evidence. The moment there's good evidence, those issues should be welcome, of course. Then there's the fallacy of balance, which we all know about. Moderation of all things can get you to a very mean, because there's the notion of Pascal's wager, which is, well, we don't know whether X does anything, but why don't we try it anyway, because we've got nothing to lose. But you've got nothing to lose only if it falls outside a zero-sum game. So if you want to have a balanced diet, and you want to include peanuts in that diet, if you've got a peanut allergy, then moderation in all things is going to be a big problem for you. Similarly, if you have obviously, if you have diabetes and you start eating a balanced carbohydrate diet, the same thing happens. So we need to reject the notion of balance, and we need to also stop people from deciding where the scale is balanced. Because, of course, our notion of a balanced diet is basically a slightly better version of the standard American diet. That would not have been any of our forebears' notion of a balanced diet. That would be considered a hideously imbalanced diet. So balance is in the eye of the beholder. There are more problems with the fallacy of balance. There's a balanced look at keto, which was done by Paleo Mom a few years ago. I don't know if any of you remember this. The green side is the good things that keto does, and the red side are all the bad things that keto does. And that's one of the things that keto does, which is quite bad, is it causes death to all systems. So, best avoid it, I would have thought. So you can see it's this really simplistic, let's balance up everything. No, and that caused a lot of issues at the time, because people who were incipiently becoming interested in keto were scared off, and there were issues there saying, especially women must never do keto because your adrenals will explode or something ridiculous. Then finally there are the noble savage insults, where you kind of have this nostalgia for a past, and even Weston A. Price can sometimes fall prey to this, although I admire him in so many ways. This yearning to go back to Eden, and a mild form of racism. You get something that's quite unpalatable, but we don't have time to go into that. We need to avoid the traps that lead to this sort of thing. in our community. So we mustn't do the same sort of thing. Now, obviously, we'd never do this, which is the heart-healthy, whole-grain, instant wholemeal, but we've got to watch out for all the memes and intentions that led to that. So we need to beware beguiling narratives, just so stories, kumbaya and karma, delicious anecdotes, or just standing up for common sense, when we know that often common sense is quite duplicitous. And also, what was really good when Dave was talking about his protocol is he's waiting for falsification. He'd be very happy to have falsification because he can then dive down a new rabbit hole, or maybe a new swan hole, because black swans have babies, and you must therefore not fear falsification. You need to realize that if your pet theory is destroyed, it just gives you something else to do in life, which is fine. Now, I mentioned this on the podcast as well. I studied a number of philosophical movements, and the kind of really flawed but charming movement in the late 30s, the Vienna Circle, were the verificationists that invented logical positivists. And they said the meaning of a statement is the method of its verification. In other words, if you want to find out the meaning of something, the meaning is literally how you verify it. And they said everything else is metaphysical nonsense or poetry. And sometimes I find this quite useful when I'm trying to cut through the BS that you see. So I saw an example a few years ago. It said, scientists discovered that grains were paleo. Let's verify that statement to ascertain its meaning. So that's the statement. Researchers in Italy found a big stone in a cave with a concave indentation. Okay, that's sense data. We could probably confirm, yeah, that looks concave, that's fine. The carbon dating equipment reported an age of approximately 32,000 years, and then we can confirm how that does that, and we can verify how the carbon dating equipment works and how accurate it is. They washed off some debris and detected what may have been small particles of starch. And again, well, how was that detection done? What were the atoms that were found? What were the confounders? What else could it have been? So you verify, verify, verify. At which point you get to do that about the statement that scientists found that grains were paleo. No, they didn't. They found a rock with some debris on it. So we have in a sense, we have two choices. You know, Ansel Keys, the American Heart Association, and Kellogg's, they chose a path. And many here discovered keto by having the intellectual courage to divert from that path. But we need to retain that flexibility. We can honor the best of our Enlightenment heritage in privileging rigorous empiricism, in refusing to be beguiled by seductive enthymemes and cozy fallacies, or we can wallow in a bath of poetical, metaphysical, nonsensical jerfdom. The choice is basically ours. And there's that old serpent and the fruit again. Thank you very much.